It is, needless to say, an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak in the Pauling lecture series, and a particular privilege to be able to do so today on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, as the contours of a new world order were being constructed from the ashes of the most terrible single catastrophe of human history. There were conflicting visions at the time of what the new world order of the day should be, and they're still highly relevant. One view was that of the United Nations, which is now possibly facing its demise. The second was a view that is sometimes called realism in international relations theory, which was critical of the utopianism that accompanied the founding of the United Nations. The realist vision was articulated with great clarity 50 years ago by one of the most respected and important statesmen of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, who was speaking for the victors, one of the big three. He explained that, I'm quoting him now, "The government of the world must be entrusted to the satisfied nations who wish nothing more for themselves than what they have. Our power placed us above the rest. We are like rich men dwelling in peace within their habitations, and we must keep the hungry nations under control, or else there will be danger." Earlier in the century, at the peak of British power before World War I, Churchill had outlined this realistic vision more fully, this time in secret, in a British cabinet meetings, records of which have recently been released after quite a few years, apparently considered rather sensitive. He said, "We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, but our claim to be left in the unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us." So we have to teach them regular lessons in reasonableness. This was part of a call for expanding the military budget. I should say a sanitized version of that did appear in his writings, but with a very different tone. I might add, it'd be only fair to add, that the more humane among the conquerors didn't find those measures so reasonable. For example, Adam Smith, who bitterly condemned what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, who he saw very clearly 200 years ago were brutally creating the first world, third world divide that is now so dramatic and was far less so at the time. Well, Adam Smith was a figure of the Enlightenment, pre-capitalist, anti-capitalist in fundamental ways, and he was also smart enough to detect the fundamental illusions of the realist picture that Churchill so eloquently articulated. The first is that, contrary to the Churchillian version, the rich men enjoying their ample habitations are never satisfied. Rather, they will follow what Adam Smith called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. The second and more crucial point is that the we who are enjoying their vast and splendid possessions were not the people of England, nor of France, nor the United States, nor other imperial powers, except occasionally by accident. Rather, continuing in his words, the principal architects of state policy design it to ensure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of their own country. That's a very valid comment. In his day, the principal architects were the merchants and manufacturers of England, as he explained. Today, it's the huge transnational corporations and financial institutions that dominate the domestic economy and, in fact, the international economy, and hence its politics as well. To correct the realist vision with Adam Smith's insights, it comes out like this. The rich men of the rich societies will pursue their vile maxim, seeking to expand their vast and splendid possessions that they have gained by violence and hold by force, resorting to savage injustice when necessary, so that and those who do not will simply fall by the wayside. The lot of the vast majority of people, including those of their own countries, is simply to serve and suffer. Well, that's the realist vision. The other vision of world order, the competing one 50 years ago, was the vision of the United Nations, or at least the rhetoric that accompanied its founding, which I won't review because you're engulfed in a flood of such pronouncements and it's unnecessary to repeat them. As to which of the conflicting visions prevailed, history has provided a rather clear and unflattering answer. Now, there were and are, of course, plenty of people deeply committed to the vision of the rhetoric that accompanied the United Nations then and now, and who sought to make it more than mere rhetoric. That includes, I suppose, the vast majority of the population of the world, which is why reality has to be masked in so much secrecy and deceit. It's why the occasional honest comment, such as Churchill's before the First World War, has to be concealed from the population for almost a century in this case. And I think it'll be a long time before they study it in British schools. Those who wanted to make the reality closer to the rhetoric included also prominent individuals, Linus and Helen Pauling ranking high among them, but real power has always resided elsewhere. Well, in the United States, attitudes toward the United Nations have oscillated over the years from great praise to utter contempt. I'll return to that at the end, suggesting a rather simple realist principle that I think accounts for the variations. But first, let's look at the failures and flaws of the United Nations that have caused these changes in attitudes towards it. Now, there is a standard version of this. It runs sort of like this. At the beginning, there were great hopes. They were dashed by the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, around 1989, 1990, there was a period of hopefulness, and then the hopes were dashed again by the ethnic conflicts that swept the world since. Here's some representative quotes from the most interesting period, 1990, right after the end of the Cold War and before the new catastrophes began. These are from the Washington Post and the New York Times and leading columnists and editorialists, but they're perfectly standard. I've actually reviewed a lot of them in print, and this is a completely exceptionless pattern. So here's a few. During the long Cold War years, the Soviet veto and the hostility of many third world nations made the United Nations an object of scorn to many Americans, who were rightly appalled by the sight of brim-faced Soviet ambassadors casting vetoes and shrill anti-Western rhetoric from third world nations. Although with the end of the Cold War, 1988-89, Soviet policy changed, bringing about a wondrous sea change in the United Nations, which can finally work the way it was designed to. Well, that's the picture as of 1990, and then comes the disillusionment. The era of ethnic conflicts replaced the Cold War, and the UN again failed to deal with them, so maybe the time has come to bid it farewell. That's in capsule form the story. What I'd like to do now is to look at these two eras, the Cold War and the ethnic conflicts, and compare the vision with the reality, and also ask just what role the UN played in this. So let's take the Cold War. Well, again, there's a standard version. I don't have to waste much time on it. You've heard it over and over. It was, for example, articulated by President Kennedy, who proclaimed that the communist world, from Havana to Moscow to Peiping, as it was in those days, to Saigon and so on, is a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy planning to take over everything else. His right-hand man, Robert McNamara, announced in his confirmation hearings that Soviet aggression has no historical parallel. Its goal is total obliteration without any hint of moral restraint anywhere to be found in the entire literature of Marxism and so on. That's the standard version. Now, there is a more sober version of that. For example, it's given in scholarship. So take say, the most respected American diplomatic historian, who's also a major historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis. He pretty much accepts what's called the orthodox position, post-revisionist position, it's often called. And realistically, he traces the Cold War to 1917, agreeing with George Kennan and others. As you know, right after the Bolshevik takeover in 1917, there was a Western invasion, and Gaddis explains the immediate Western invasion as defensive. On the side, I should say that this invasion was taken rather seriously. For example, Britain used poison gas, which is the ultimate atrocity in those days, like nuclear weapons after World War II. Usually poison gas in those days was reserved to those who were called recalcitrant Arabs or uncivilized tribesmen, among whom it would spread a lively terror. Again, quoting Winston Churchill in documents released about 15 years ago and yet to enter popular consciousness. Also worth reading. Well, why was the Western invasion defensive, according to Gaddis? Because it was a preemptive strike, he explains. It was taken to ward off a potential Soviet actions. In his words, it was a response to a potentially far-reaching intervention by the new Soviet government in the internal affairs, not just of the West, but of virtually every country in the world, namely the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist system. So as a preemptive strike and therefore justified. What was the challenge? Well, the challenge was obviously not military conquest, certainly not at that time, and in fact not at any time, he argues, agreeing with most serious scholarship and in fact with the internal documents. Rather, the challenge, the potential challenge that was going to come that justified the defensive invasion was the demonstration effect of an alternative social model, development model, that might have appeal in the traditional service areas of the South, but even among working people and the poor in the industrial societies themselves. That was a prospect that very greatly concerned Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, his Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and many others. And indeed, that remains the primary concern as far as the documentary record reaches, which right now is into the 1960s. Right through, that's the primary concern over the Soviet challenge. For example, when John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Macmillan of England were discussing the Soviet challenge in the early 60s, that was precisely their concern. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union, the same concerns were voiced with regard to China and Vietnam and many others. In short, it was the perceived success of the so-called communist model. It has nothing to do with communism, but that's what it's called. It's the perceived success of the communist model that was considered a threat. And that's pretty understandable when you look at the situation in the comparable Western domains. I should add that Stalin's awesome crimes were, of course, well known, but almost totally irrelevant to these calculations. Truman, for example, liked and admired Stalin, thought he was honest, said what happened inside the Soviet Union he didn't care about. He thought it would be a disaster if anything happened to the great man and his great friend, and said he could get along fine with Stalin as long as the United States got its way 85% of the time. Churchill took the same view, in internal records, of course. As late as early 1945, after Yalta, that is, Churchill in internal cabinet records was defending Stalin as honest and trustworthy, and we've got to deal with him. He admired him. He spoke, in fact, very glowingly of him in private meetings. The fact that he was a mass murderer was known, but not relevant. In this respect, Stalin falls into a sort of there's a pretty traditional pattern. He falls into a long line of monsters and gangsters, including Suharto, who will be visiting in a week or so, Trujillo, Saddam Hussein, and a host of other killers and torturers, including the man who President Roosevelt called that admirable Italian gentleman who had brought fascism to Italy, and even including Hitler well into the late 1930s. The crimes are irrelevant. What's problematic is not following orders, that we don't get our way 85% of the time or more. History is very clear on that. A few years before the Kennedy-McMillan exchanges that I just mentioned, President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had highlighted the central issue in private internal discussions, recently declassified. They were lamenting the ability of the communists, so-called, to appeal directly to the masses and gain control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate because the poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich, the big problem of world history. And as Eisenhower and Dulles and many others recognized, their own position on who should plunder whom was a pretty hard sell. And so the opposition had a kind of an unfair advantage, and they were trying to figure out how to deal with this. Well, I'm only sampling a rich record, which suggests a rather different perspective on the Cold War. That perspective happens to be reinforced quite powerfully, I think, when you look further, for example, at the quite rich and interesting record of declassified planning documents, which stress forcefully and consistently that the major threat to U.S. interests, I'm now quoting, is radical nationalism that calls for improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs based on the principle that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country, not foreign investors, a conception that must be destroyed in all its forms, as the State Department insisted in the Charter for the Americas that it imposed on the Western Hemisphere right in 1945 as the New World Order was being established. Those are the consistent themes that run through the whole record, as they do for Britain before us, and though I haven't looked, I imagine France and Belgium and anybody else you look at. There's also a public record, which is consistent with this. And some pretty dramatic examples of it. So take one example from just a few years ago. You recall that about 10 years ago the United States was engaged in what the World Court condemned as the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, when the World Court condemned the United States for its aggression against Nicaragua, ordered it to desist from the crimes, as well as the unlawful economic warfare, and of course the U.S. dismissed the judgment without concern, and in fact Congress voted right after it another $100 million to increase the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua. Well, at that time, the selling point, what the Reagan administration used to sell Congress on the need to do this, was the Sandinista, the announcement by the government of Nicaragua that they were conducting a revolution without borders. And that became the centerpiece of the U.S. propaganda campaign. It was all over the media, the journals. As I say, it induced Congress to step up the war. The Sandinistas had actually announced that they were going to conquer the world. In case you didn't know it, they were going to carry out a revolution without borders. Well, that's an interesting case. It's because in fact, it was based on some reality, as propaganda usually is. It was based on a speech by a Sandinista leader, Thomas Borge, in which he said, every country has to carry out its own revolution. We can't interfere with anyone else, but we would like to construct a model that will work so well that others will want to follow it. So that, and in that sense, he said, our revolution transcends borders. So in a certain sense, the U.S. propaganda was correct. He, again, was issuing a challenge that others might want to a development model that others might want to follow, and that requires a defensive response, namely international terrorism and aggression and terror and torture and so on, because, after all, we have to defend ourselves from that challenge. So there was something true about the fabrication. Incidentally, the fabrication was perfectly well known. It was exposed instantly, right in the mainstream, in the Washington Post, in fact, within days, but nobody cared. It was just too useful. So therefore, it continued to be reiterated as a Sandinista revolution without borders. It's kind of an interesting fact about our own intellectual culture that this kind of thing can happen so easily and so often. Another point of view from which you can gain some perspective on the reality of the Cold War, I think, is to carry out the following test, which is indeed rather useful after any war. It's very interesting after any war is over to ask who's rejoicing and who's unhappy. When you carry out that test, it often makes the war look rather different than the way it was interpreted. It tells you a lot about what it was really about. So let's look at the Cold War. Who's rejoicing and who's unhappy? Well, in the East, the people who are rejoicing are easy to find. That's the old Communist Party leadership. They are rich beyond their wildest dreams, just delighted with everything that's happened. Obviously, they're the victors in the Cold War. They are now the managers of the U.S. enterprises that are being set up. They're sort of taking on the role of the typical third world elite. Very rich, very powerful, working for the bosses somewhere else, and very well off. So they're delighted. They're called, in fact, the capitalist nomenclatura very often. It's the old Communist Party hacks who are now very powerful, very rich, very much beloved by the West. So they're the victors. They won the Cold War. What about the rest of who's unhappy about the end of the Cold War in the East? Well, there are regular polls now taken by the West about attitudes in Russia and so on, Western-run polls, so pretty accurate. And one of the questions they ask regularly is, what do you think is the best period of Russian history? Well, the latest one that was taken, two-thirds said the pre-perestroika period, before Gorbachev. That was the best period, two-thirds. That's up from 50% about in 1992. The optimism about the future has declined. That's Russia, but the point, it's rather general through the region. People are delighted that the tyranny has collapsed, but they're less than happy about returning to the third world status that they had before. So they're less than happy about the fact that since 1989, in Russia, there have been about 500,000 excess deaths resulting from the reforms, according to a recent UNESCO study, which indeed approves of the reforms but gives the figures. So there's people who won the war in the East, and there's people who lost the war in the East. What about in the West? Well, among the people who are rejoicing about the end of the Cold War are Western business leaders. For example, the directors of General Motors and Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen and so on. And they're delighted for reasons that are explained with great clarity in the international business press, for example, the British Financial Times, which has been pointing out that the big gains from the end of the Cold War. Typical example is an article called "Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins." It's all horrible over there, but something good, some green shoots. The green shoots are that the effect of the capitalist reforms has been to cause tremendous impoverishment and unemployment, so it is now possible for Western investors to get highly trained, skilled, educated workers for a fraction of the cost of the pampered Western workers, I'm quoting, who will have to abandon their luxurious lifestyles, as Business Week added. So they're delighted. On the other hand, who's unhappy in the West? Well, among the people who are unhappy are the pampered Western workers, who are less than overjoyed about having to give up their luxurious lifestyles now that, say, General Motors or Daimler-Benz can not only threaten and in fact bring down their wages and benefits and increase their working hours and so on by either moving or threatening to move to Mexico, but now also to Poland and Slovakia and so on. So they are less than delighted. They lost the Cold War. Well, if you look at it this way, there are winners and there are losers. The winners are the Communist Party leadership and Western business leaders. The losers are the people in Eastern Europe and the people in the West. Actually, that's not uncommon after wars, and it relates to Adam Smith's point about who the we are when you talk about we. Well, that gives you another point of view on it. This alternative, and I think more realistic perspective on the Cold War, makes even more sense when you look at it in a broader historical perspective. So East and West Europe did not be, the differentiation between Eastern and West Europe goes back to the 15th century. The last time they looked alike was about the 15th century. At that point, Western Europe was beginning to develop, and Eastern Europe was beginning to turn into its service area, its third world, as we would call it now, providing resources and raw materials and cheap labor and investment opportunities and markets and so on. That was beginning around the 15th century, actually pre-Columbus, on a fault line, incidentally, that runs kind of through Germany. And it continued, that difference continued to deepen right into this century. So, say, Russia was becoming relatively impoverished relative to the West more and more up until the First World War. And for large parts of Eastern Europe, it continued up till the Second World War. So the East-West relationship was a First World, Third World relationship, what's called a North-South relationship these days, one of the euphemisms that's used for the European conquest of the world. Now, the North-South conflict has a certain logic to it. The logic is that the South, the service areas of the Third World, they are to pursue only what's called complementary development. Complementary to the interests of Western power. They're not supposed to follow these bad ideas about development on the basis of the principle that the beneficiaries of a people's resources should be the people of that country. Got to knock that out of their heads. They're to follow complementary development, which supports the interests of the rich men in the rich societies in Churchillian realistic rhetoric. And if they try to pursue a path of independent development, that's got to be stopped. And it's sometimes stopped by violence, sometimes in other ways, but it's got to be stopped. That's the North-South conflict. There's another part to it. If that independent development goes on and it begins to look successful, that is, if there is a demonstration effect, then they become what is called in the planning documents a rotten apple that might spoil the barrel, or a virus that might infect others. And obviously you can't allow a virus to spread, so they've got to be eliminated. For example, Allende's Chile was described by Henry Kissinger as a virus that might infect people all the way to Italy, not because Chile was going to conquer Rome, but because it might send the wrong message to Italian voters, namely that social democratic parliamentary procedures can succeed. And that's got to be stopped. So the government was overthrown and a neo-Nazi regime was instituted and supported. And that's very typical. So problem one is independence. Problem two is the virus effect. That's the basic logic of the North-South conflict. And if you think about the East-West conflict, a good part of it fits into that framework. There was a big piece of the Third World was following a path of independence, and furthermore, it was becoming a virus. It was imposing that challenge that was so threatening from 1917 at least into the 1960s for the reasons I mentioned. Well, Russia is not a typical piece of the Third World. It's not like Grenada. It's a sixth of the world. Even when it was a deeply impoverished Third World country under the Tsar, it still had a big military force, which frightened people. And that was even more so in the 20th century. So this particular aspect of the North-South conflict took on a life of its own, and that's called the Cold War. But basically, a lot of it falls right into the traditional North-South framework, I think, when you think it through from this point of view, which I think is the accurate one. I should also add that the aftermath of the Cold War is completely intelligible and indeed predictable in these terms. Most of the region is going back where it was. So the parts that were part of the industrial West, like the Czech Republic and Western Poland, are again becoming like the industrial West. And the parts that were deeply impoverished Third World countries are going back pretty much to that status. They look more and more like the Third World, with the small, wealthy elites, the old Communist Party to a large extent, and the suffering and impoverished mass of the population, typical view wherever you go, Mexico, South, Egypt, anywhere. This position is reinforced, I think, when you look at the continuity of policy right through the whole period. So let's just take the period when the Cold War ended, 1989, certainly ended by the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. And just look what's happened since. We have a huge Pentagon system. So what has happened to the Pentagon budget since the end of the Cold War? We needed this huge military system because we had to defend ourselves from the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. Okay, the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy isn't there. So what happened to the Pentagon system? Answer, it's the same. It's actually higher in real terms than under Nixon, right now about 85% of the Cold War average, and going up. The current Congress is driving it up. So obviously that couldn't have been the reason. The reason we were told for 50 years can't be the reason. In fact, there is a new official reason. The reason is now we have to defend ourselves from the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's literally the case. Not from the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy anymore. And that has about as much plausibility as the other one, so obviously it's a different reason, and it's not very hard to figure out. What about other policies? Well, take, say, Cuba, on the front pages right now. For 30 years, we had to defend ourselves from Cuba. We had to carry out the world's biggest international terrorist campaign and economic warfare and so on and so forth because we were defending ourselves from the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. Okay, Berlin Wall falls, no monolithic and ruthless conspiracy, so what do? We intensify the pressure against Cuba. We make the embargo tighter, and now even more so. So something's got to be wrong with that story. As the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, well, the first event that took place after the fall of the Berlin Wall was the U.S. invasion of Panama a few weeks later. Now, that's so typical an event that it barely merits a footnote in history. I mean, it's the kind of thing that happens over and over. But there was a difference this time. For a long time, every such action was justified by defense against the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. We had to defend ourselves from the communists and their revolutions without borders and so on. They were gone. So this time we were defending ourselves from Hispanic narco-traffickers led by the archdemon Noriega, who was in fact kidnapped and brought here and tried for crimes that he committed while he was on the CIA payroll. Kind of small point. But that was a difference, but not a very significant difference. At the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United Nations, let's turn now to the United Nations, they were in session. That was their winter session. And there were indeed some Security Council vetoes, 3. One Security Council veto was on Israel's actions in the occupied territories, voted 14-1. The United States vetoed it. The other two were condemnations of the U.S. attack on Panama, both vetoed by the United States. The General Assembly also had some very lopsided votes, which are kind of similar to vetoes, no technical veto there. There were two, in fact. One was a resolution condemning the continuation of the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, voted unanimously U.S. and Israel alone against. Another was a resolution condemning Washington's illegal economic warfare against Nicaragua, again, 2 votes against, United States and Israel. That's actually 1 vote when you think about it. It's like Russia and the Ukraine, were counted 2 votes. This incidentally continues. Just recently there was a vote in the General Assembly resolution condemning the illegal U.S. economic warfare against Cuba, 2 votes against the United States and Israel. The preceding year, the U.S. had gotten Romania, but they dropped off. Actually, that's a rather traditional, it's a very traditional pattern. It again, recall the standard line about the grim-faced Soviet ambassadors and the Soviet vetoes that were paralyzing the United Nations. Now, the only thing that's wrong with that is the facts, which are they're not debatable. They're, perfectly clear and explicit facts. Since the 1960s, the United States is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. In second place is the United Kingdom. France is a distant third, and the Soviet Union is fourth. That's not controversial. That's a fact. The same is true in the General Assembly. There are plenty of votes in the General Assembly with numbers like 153-1 or 150-2 or something like that on a wide range of issues, including aggression, human rights, international law, observance of international law, terrorism, and so on. And if you look through them, you'll find consistently the one is the United States, with maybe Israel or El Salvador or somebody dragging along. That's a very consistent pattern since the 1960s. It's almost totally suppressed in our free press. And not only is it suppressed, but there's just endless lying about it. The opposite is claimed, dramatically different from the easily documentable facts, uncontroversial facts, which again is an interesting fact about our intellectual culture. You can think about it and draw the obvious conclusions. Well, let's put that aside and turn to ethnic conflicts. There have been definitely ethnic conflicts since the end of the Cold War, namely within the imperial system that collapsed, the Soviet Union. So inside the former Soviet Union, the Balkans, where imperial systems have collapsed, there are ethnic conflicts. However, that's hardly a new phase in world history, and it doesn't call for any deep thoughts from leading intellectuals. In fact, it is standard and expected with the decline of some system of authority and tyranny. So post-colonial Africa quickly broke into ethnic conflicts. Or to take the most recent case prior to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, take the Portuguese Empire. That's the last empire that collapsed in 1975. And immediately it led to violent ethnic conflicts in Africa and Southeast Asia, where the Portuguese colonies were. The 3 most important were Mozambique, Angola, and Timor. These are the most dramatic cases of ethnic conflict in the modern era, and they don't have anything to do with the Cold War. They go back to 1975. With regard to Mozambique and Angola, there isn't a lot of time, so perhaps I can just quote the eminent British historian of Africa, Basil Davidson, who says that, in his words, those responsible for the contra-subversions against Mozambique and Angola will be cursed by history for enormous and terrible crimes which will long weigh heavily on the whole of southern Africa. He's referring to you and me, incidentally, if it's not obvious, and he's quite right, in fact, too kind. The United Nations Commission on Africa estimates over 1.5 million dead and over 60 billion in damages in the Reagan years alone, 1980 to 1988, by way of South Africa with strong U.S. support, That's within the framework of what's called here constructive engagement. And in Angola it continues at a horrible level, worse than the Balkans, in fact. Well, that's two of the ethnic conflicts. The third, Timor, is not a slight matter. It's the worst slaughter relative to population since the Holocaust, a clear, unambiguous ethnic conflict, and indeed the worst case in post-war history. Outright aggression, still continuing. We're getting to the 20th anniversary of it in a few weeks. And it's true that the United Nations failed to stop it. Big failure, so therefore let's dismantle the United Nations until we look a little more closely. And we find that it's true that the United Nations failed to stop it because the U.S. blocked the United Nations. In the words of our ambassador, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the State Department, the U.S. government wanted things to turn out as they did, and it was my task, he writes, to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do to prevent the aggression, and I was very successful in this task. He takes great pride in it, then points out that within a few weeks about a tenth of the population had been slaughtered, approximately the level of total casualties in Eastern Europe under the Nazi attack, he says. I'm not adding that. And then he goes on to the next sentence. So it's true that the United Nations, next topic. So the United Nations was indeed rendered utterly ineffective, but it's not the problem with the United Nations. As for the attack itself, the U.S. role was decisive, not only diplomatically, but also militarily. The invading Indonesian army was 90% equipped with American arms under a treaty that required that they can be used only for self-defense. Henry Kissinger, who was then Secretary of State, secretly sent more arms immediately, right after the invasion. A couple of years later, the Indonesian army had actually was beginning to run out of arms because of the ferocity of the assault. So President Jimmy Carter took off a little time from sermons about human rights and escalated the flow of arms at the point when the slaughter was really approaching genocide in 1978. There's consequences to this. Ambassador Moynihan, as now Senator, is hailed all over the place for his dedication to international law and morality. He's a lone voice of honor at the United Nations, standing up against all kind of third world tyrants, now proclaiming about the United Nations, unless it's able to stop genocide in Bosnia, it has no right to exist, and so on and so forth. Jimmy Carter, need not mention. Henry Kissinger is also giving speeches about the importance of peacekeeping at the United Nations and so on. What about the coverage of all of this here? Well, interestingly, Timor's a pretty remote place, but the coverage of it was quite high pre-1975 in the context of concern about the collapsing Portuguese Empire. When the invasion took place with decisive U.S. diplomatic and military support, coverage began to decline. What there was all, in fact, reiteration of State Department lies or quoting Indonesian generals. By 1978, when the atrocities peaked and new U.S. arms were flowing, coverage reached zero in the United States, not a word anywhere. Also interesting. Now, the story continues. There were changes. By the 1980s, coverage began, sometimes accurate coverage. But it's interesting in character. The tone of the coverage is given, for example, by a New York Times editorial headed "Shaming of Indonesia." Well, okay, shaming of Indonesia, but how about shaming of the United States or shaming of the New York Times? That's a perception you're not allowed to have. Or you read that we didn't do enough, we made a mistake, we didn't do enough to stop the carnage and the terror and so on. Well, the fact is we did more than enough, as Ambassador Moynihan has himself written, and as the record of military aid shows. It wasn't that we didn't do enough. That's like saying that if the Russians had said we didn't do enough to stop the atrocities in Hungary or something. Yeah, that's not quite the way to put it. In the 1980s, it has changed. Now there is, in fact, coverage, and some good things have happened. So there's been enough popular pressure in the last couple of years to induce Congress to put some constraints on U.S. participation in this still continuing atrocity. That's caused the Clinton administration to have to search for sort of devious ways to avoid the congressional restrictions, which it indeed has done. But nevertheless, that's important. It's symbolically significant and might, even with enough pressure, lead to Indonesian withdrawal. That's conceivable. There have also been big changes inside Indonesia, though we don't hear about them. Human rights groups, student groups, labor leaders, independent intellectuals, and so on, have begun to speak quite openly, condemning the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, and in fact speaking up for human rights and rights of working people and so on. Now, in Indonesia, to stand up and talk about these things is not so simple. It's not like here. Here you do it, nothing happens to you. There you do it, you're in a terrorist, tyrannical and vicious state, but they're doing it. And that's another thing that might be called the shaming of the United States, I think. Not only that we don't report it and support them, but that we don't do it ourselves, which is certainly a lot easier. Well, the end of the Portuguese Empire 20 years ago led to ethnic conflicts that are far worse than the consequences of the end of the Soviet Empire, the end of the French Empire, long, slow process. That led to still worse consequences, the Algerian War, the wars in Indochina. Our own wars in Indochina left about 4 million people dead and 3 countries in total ruin. In this case, the aggressors benefit from impunity within the doctrinal system, and these aren't even called ethnic conflicts because we're one of the participants. But if we use the term in any meaningful sense, these are ethnic conflicts on a huge scale, with far dwarfing anything that's happened after the fall of the Soviet Empire. There was a Cold War element in all of these things, but it was very far at the margins when you take a serious look, and indeed that's recognized in internal documents. Well, let's take a look elsewhere, say the Middle East. There's a symbol of ethnic conflict, namely Lebanon, for quite some time, 20 years, so nothing to do with the end of the Cold War. Lebanon occasionally makes it to the front pages here. So, for example, after the bombing of the Oklahoma City bombing, you remember, big headlines all over about how Oklahoma City looks like Beirut, big tragedy. The horrors of Beirut are coming right to mainstream America. Furthermore, if we ever find if it turns out that the people who did that horrible atrocity were from the Middle East, we're going to bomb everybody in sight, and so on and so forth. Well, that was the reaction to the Oklahoma City bombing, and it was not entirely false. Oklahoma City was indeed looking like Beirut. Of course, Beirut has been looking like Beirut for quite some time. For example, Beirut looked like Beirut exactly 10 years earlier, almost to the day, since we like anniversaries. That was when the largest car bomb in history went off in Beirut. This was the worst terrorist act in the Middle East at the peak of concern about international terrorism. It was a bomb, big, huge car bomb, very much like Oklahoma City. It was set off outside a mosque, timed to go off to kill the maximum number of people when they were leaving, killed mostly women and children, all over the place, children in their beds and all sorts of things. Very much like Oklahoma City, huge catastrophes. Now, in that case, it's not too difficult to chase the perpetrators to the ends of the earth or to bomb any country that's harboring them and so on, at least if the U.S. Air Force has the capacity to bomb Washington and California and Texas and so on, with maybe a few extra bombs left in London. And the reason is because, as is perfectly openly acknowledged, the bombing was carried out by the CIA with the assistance of British intelligence. So it's true, Oklahoma City was looking like Beirut for good reasons, because Beirut looked like Beirut, and there's no problem finding the perpetrators and punishing them. Just Sunday in the United Nations, Clinton called upon all the nations of the world to join with us in ending the horror of international terrorism and making sure that any nation that tolerates international terrorists becomes a pariah and is punished and so on. Again, that's easily within our power. but somehow none of this ever gets discussed. It's not that the press, say, or intellectuals are unaware of the fact that the Oklahoma City bombing was a virtual duplicate of the Beirut bombing 10 years earlier. Of course they're aware of it. I know from personally, I brought it to the attention of lots of journalists in the United States and England, if they hadn't been aware of it themselves, which they probably were. But this is undiscussable and unreportable, just as you cannot speak of U.S. aggression or ethnic conflict when there's a conflict between us and people in Indochina that ends up with 4 million of them killed and so on. So yeah, Lebanon is the very symbol of ethnic conflict, and there's some reasons for the problems there. There is also a grand success in the Middle East right next door in overcoming ethnic conflicts. Just a couple of Nobel Peace Prizes recently. Oslo II just took place. It was a day of awe, as the headlines said, in which we celebrated the U.S. triumph in bringing to an end, at least close to an end, this terrible ethnic conflict between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. Actually, what happened there is a little different. There's not much time to talk about it, but in fact what happened was a most impressive power play by the United States which tells a lot about the New World Order and also about the failures of the United Nations. Fact of the matter is that for about 25 years, the United States has been rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective in anything it might do to bring about a resolution of that conflict, a diplomatic resolution. That's certainly been true since February 1971, when Egypt accepted U.S. policy, official U.S. policy on the Middle East, and called for a full peace treaty with Israel on the international borders with all the security guarantees and all the wordings of the resolutions, in fact identical to official U.S. policy. That was with the support of virtually the entire world. Israel rejected it, recognized it to be a genuine peace order, but rejected it, and Henry Kissinger succeeded in, there was a split inside the U.S. government as to whether to continue with our traditional policy or to shift to opposing our traditional policy and opposing negotiations and diplomatic settlement. And Kissinger won that battle, achieving what he called stalemate, meaning no diplomacy. And ever since then, the United States has been opposed to a diplomatic settlement. Well, that settlement was organized by the United Nations, UN mediator. So that's one time when the UN was rendered utterly ineffective by a U.S. veto. That became a literal veto a few years later, January 1976, when the Security Council debated a resolution calling for a political settlement, supported by the entire world, in fact. The Arab states, PLO supported it, Western Europe supported it, non-aligned countries, Eastern Europe. It was vetoed by the United States, out of history, like the February 71 events. That was under Kissinger again. Same thing happened under Carter, same resolution eliminated. The Security Council was eliminated. The issue, therefore, came up regularly in the General Assembly, in fact, every year. The votes were always like 150 to 2 or something like that. The last of those votes was the last serious vote was December 1990. Date is important. That was the last of them, of the annual votes. It was 144 to 2, usual numbers. Then what happened after December 1990? Well, right after that came the Gulf War. And the Gulf War effectively got the rest of the world to understand that well, actually, George Bush put it rather clearly, that the New World Order is, in effect, in his words, it means what we say goes, certainly in the Middle East, and the rest of the world just backed off. Europe pulled out of the game, the non-aligned countries were out of it, total disarray, the Arab world completely collapsed. At this point, the U.S. could ram through its own completely rejectionist proposal, which involves limited instead of complete withdrawal and no rights at all for the Palestinians. That's the position the U.S. had upheld against the rest of the world for 25 years, and now is able to ram it through. A genuine peace process could be instituted, as it was immediately at Madrid. It's genuine because it was under unilateral U.S. control, and it followed the rejectionist U.S. position. And that's exactly what has been implemented. In fact, what has been implemented, even Oslo II, is harsher than any proposal that the Israeli government itself had ever made from 1968 right up to the present. So naturally, it's a day of awe. And another case in which the UN failed for reasons that are worth thinking about. Well, final comment. We're now back to the UN after 50 years. There's a good deal of self-righteous commentary about its failings. I've given some indication of why and where it failed, I think. You can check and see if you think this is right. The lion's share of that responsibility falls, not very surprisingly, on the world's most powerful states, and in particular its most powerful state, exactly as any rational person would have expected. The most powerful state has indeed been rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective, in Ambassador Moynihan's words, since the 1960s, when the United Nations fell under what is called here the tyranny of the majority, sometimes known as democracy, and it stopped just following orders. That was one of the consequences of decolonization. The commentary on all of this is quite amazing. I sampled some of it, but the whole story is amazing. Well, right now, the last couple of years, and increasingly now, in fact, more announcements in this morning's paper, the United States is proceeding to dismantle the United Nations. On May 1st, Congress announced radical cuts in U.S. assistance to UNICEF and similar organizations. That was very well timed. On May 1st, UNICEF had its annual press conference. UNICEF, of course, is run by an American. The U.S. insisted on that as another standard power play, Carol Bellamy. And she gave the press conference, which wasn't reported, but interesting. UNICEF estimated that the number of children who were dying from easily treatable diseases, meaning you can cure it for a few pennies a day, had risen from 11 million a year to 13 million a year. And that's what UNICEF was trying to deal with. So on that day, aside from not reporting the UNICEF report, Congress cut aid to UNICEF. And in fact, UNICEF will disappear. It has the wrong priorities. The FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, that's slated for disappearance. Again, it has the wrong priorities, poor and hungry people around the world. The International Labor Organization, that's going to go the same way. And there's a reason for that. The ILO deals with worker rights. The U.S. has the worst record in the Western Hemisphere and Europe, with the exception of El Salvador and Lithuania, so we're third actually, in ratifying conventions on worker rights, including things like children's labor and things like that. And furthermore, the ILO committed an additional crime 2 years ago. It criticized the United States. It very rarely criticizes a rich industrial country, but it broke the pattern and criticized the United States for violating international labor standards by the employment of permanent replacement workers, which is in gross violation of universally accepted international labor standards. So they have to go. They're obviously not to be allowed, and they're going to disappear. The UN Development Agency, same story. U.S. has sharply cut funding for it and is going to get rid of it. It has the wrong priorities, the vast majority of the world's population. There used to be a monitoring office, just provided data on transnational corporations. In fact, it was the only source of information on transnational corporations. That was killed a couple of years ago. It's the wrong information. It was pretty hard to get the information anyway, but at least you could get it. No, you just can't. UNESCO has a third world orientation that's almost dead and will die under a good deal of blatant fraud about new information order and so on, which is what actually happened, and the fraud about it is well documented in scholarly work published by university presses, but unreviewable. UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, that's slated to disappear. It was announced this morning, in fact, because its functions will be taken over by the World Trade Organization, so it's irrelevant. Well, for those of you who know about these issues, that's total nonsense. The problem with UNCTAD is that it keeps refuting the neoliberal fundamentalism of the World Trade Organization and showing that it's false and fabricated and so on. They've got economists who are giving the wrong analysis. They're continually undermining the claims about the wonders of the free market that are preached by the World Trade Organization, but preached in a very special way. They're preached to the poor abroad and at home. They have to accept market discipline, but they're not preached to people like, say, Newt Gingrich and his constituency, Cobb County, Georgia, which gets more federal subsidies than any comparable county in the country because it's represented by the biggest welfare freak in the country. And in fact, quite typically, the wealthy and the powerful have never accepted market discipline. They always have massive state protection in all sorts of ways. In our case, the biggest form of subsidy transfer payments to the rich is the Pentagon. And that's why the budget doesn't go down, in fact goes up when reactionary statists of the current type take over. So no market discipline for them, but plenty of market discipline for the poor, except that UNCTAD makes the mistake of documenting, explaining, and analyzing the consequences of all of this, so they have to go to be taken over by the World Trade Organization that doesn't have these defects. In fact, the more kind of democratic elements of the United Nations are slated for dismissal, and maybe the whole thing will go. That's not been passed unnoticed, I should say. The South Commission, which represents the overwhelming majority of the population of the world, the non-aligned countries, they published an important book a couple of years ago called Challenge to the South, published by Oxford University Press, unreviewed to my knowledge, which called for a new world order based on justice and freedom, and they explained what's going on in the world rather well, and they pointed out that the more democratic parts of the UN are being dismantled, the parts that have commitment to the general population instead of those who matter. None of this ever gets discussed or reported apart from the margins, just as the actual record on vetoes, General Assembly votes, and much else. Again, these are things that might interest us, might even concern us, at least those people who have some concern for the nature of our own society and our own culture. Well, as to the principle that explains the attitudes towards the United Nations that are articulated by the intellectual culture, I'm afraid the principle is all too simple. Insofar as the United Nations is following the orders of Churchill's rich men and the rich societies, exactly to that extent it is honored. To the extent it deviates from that, it is condemned. It's rare in a complicated world for a simple criterion to be such a good predictor, but if you look carefully, you'll find that this is an extremely good predictor of the whole oscillation up and back, including the hopefulness in 1990. Well, if Churchillian realism continues to prevail in the global system, and incidentally increasingly at home as well, because there's an obvious domestic analog to all this, if that's the case, then the future is going to be bleak. But we should remember that these are by no means laws of nature, nor are they laws of society, even if such laws exist. But these are human decisions that can be made differently within human decisions, the human institutions that have no particular claim to permanence or even legitimacy. As throughout history, all of this can be changed, as it has been in the past, and in the same ways as in the past, and the age-old struggle for greater justice and freedom can be advanced if we so choose. Thanks.
You've been listening to MIT Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy, Noam Chomsky, delivering the 1995 Ava Helen and Linus Pauling Memorial Lecture for World Peace. The title of Professor Chomsky's lecture was Prospects for World Order. The lecture was delivered on the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis, Oregon, on October 24, 1995. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment of the program. Noam Chomsky is world-renowned for his revolutionary work in linguistics and philosophy. He was an early opponent of the United States invasion and war in Vietnam, and has since become equally well known for his criticism of U.S. foreign policy throughout the world. At the time of this lecture, October 24, 1995, his most recent book was World Orders, Old and New. In recent years, his publications include Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, and Perilous Power, The Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy, Dialogues on Terror, Democracy, War, and Justice, with Gilbert Achcar. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit his website at www.chomsky.info. And now we return to the question and answer segment of the program.
Okay, I'm sorry there are no microphones in the hall, but if people want to say something and talk, you speak. I'll probably hear you, and I'll repeat if people can't.
How does the U.S. get such enormous veto power in the U.S.?
How does the U.S. get such enormous veto power? Simply take the realist position that Churchill articulated. The rich men and the rich societies run the show, and simply ask yourself, who are the richest men and which is the richest society? The United States is overwhelmingly the richest and most powerful society in the world by any measure. Economic power, military power, security, you name it. So, of course, it has the biggest voice. I mean, what could be more obvious? Except in terms, from the point of view of the propaganda system, which naturally tries to efface the obvious. But if you think about it reasonably, what else would you expect to happen? Now, of course, it doesn't have to happen, but it'll only change if people inside the United States, which is also maybe the freest country in the world, do something about it. We're not living in Indonesia, we're not living in Iraq. It's easy to get here to change policy, but of course first you have to be aware of it, and you have to want to change it, and you have to do something about it. Otherwise it'll just go by the natural processes.
Recently there's begun to seep into a few public accounts the UNESCO situation in 1983, in which the Western press accused the other nations of the world attempting to destroy press freedom.
Right.
But that was really an attempt of Western press that is now being said to retain its iron grip on the news of the world. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Could you hear? No, he pointed out correctly that in, was it 1983, around then? 1983, yeah. Early in the 80s, the UNESCO called for what was called a new information order, and it came under bitter attack in the West. American press, government, intellectuals, and so on still being attacked for trying to impose constraints on press freedom. And in fact, that's not what it was claiming. That's not what the new information order was calling for. What it was calling for was an end to the monopoly over global information on the part of powerful Western, actually tyrannical institutions, which is what the private media corporations are. That's what they were calling for. The fraud was exposed at once. There are very good academic studies of it. The best one I know is a book published by the University of Minnesota Press, edited by William Preston, Edward Herman, and Herbert Schiller. Careful academic study showing what the actual information order was, how the West reacted, how exposing the lies about it. Very effective. Never reviewed, never discussed. The book's called Hope and Folly. And the attack on the UNESCO continues unchanged, just like the Revolution Without Borders. People like, say, Erskine Childers, a distinguished Irish diplomat who's been in the UN forever, has written about this, and others write about it, but without any ability to penetrate into our intellectual culture, which isn't remarkably, we don't live under tyranny, but the similarity to totalitarianism is pretty dramatic sometimes.
Could you give us your view on the war in the Balkans?
War in the Balkans? Well, it's bad enough, but it doesn't compare with the usual consequences of the breakup of tyrannical systems. Like, it's nowhere near as bad as what followed the breakup of the Portuguese Empire or the French Empire and so on, but it's bad enough. I might say that even during the last few years, the war in Angola has been going on since 1985. And even in the 90s, the atrocities in Angola were worse by a long shot than the Balkans. So compare, for example, Sarajevo and Quito. Well, everybody knows about Sarajevo. Huge coverage of Sarajevo, horror, crude Serbian peasants bombarding Sarajevo. It is an atrocity, and about 10,000 people have been killed. During the same years, about 25,000 people have been killed in Quito. That's just one town in Angola. Of course, they've been killed, and you can check to see how many index entries there are for Quito in the New York Times. They're being killed by the kind of person who's the wrong person to mention, namely by a person who was hailed as a leading freedom fighter in the 1980s and a great hero, namely a man who was running the counter-subversion that we were backing, that Basil Davidson, who I quoted, said would be cursed by history. So therefore, we better not talk about that one. But going back to the Balkans, it's bad enough. It's nowhere near other things, but bad enough. The reasons for it you can debate and argue, but I think it's pretty clear where it's going. U.S. policy has been more or less to Europe has wanted to quiet it down because it's dangerous for Europe. The United States also wants it to quiet down, not blow up into a regional conflict that might involve Turkey and Greece and harm U.S. interests anywhere. As long as it's contained, it's not a big problem for the West, and therefore, the European powers have become involved in peacekeeping and relief operations. The U.S. refuses to become involved at all, except just to bomb somebody, but not do anything else. U.S. policy has been to keep it contained, and now that it looks like the kind of solution that Washington has wanted may be achievable, the U.S. is moving in to try to achieve it. That solution is a partition of the former Yugoslavia into a greater Serbia and a greater Croatia. Croatia being our ally, which is getting U.S. military support and aid and training. And it looks like that's what's happening. I mean, behind the facade of, preserving Bosnia and so on, it looks like what's emerging is a partition between Serbia and Croatia, in which there may be something called Bosnia, but mostly on paper. And now that looks feasible, Washington is indeed trying to move in to implement it, and there's some conflict now between the White House and Congress as to, whether to even go that far. There are all sorts of reasons for this, and one could look into it, but I think that's the rough contours of it.
What are your hopes for this country?
This country? It depends what we do with it. This country has all sorts of advantages, all sorts of prospects, extraordinary wealth, tremendous amount of freedom, all kind of privilege. It is what you make of it.
What can I do to defeat this tyranny? Does voting matter? What matters? What can I do?
Just ask yourself what's changed anything in the past. We got a couple thousand years of history to look at. What individuals did never made any difference. What organized groups of people did made a big difference. That's why we don't have feudalism, we don't have slavery. In recent years, the civil rights movement is an example, the anti-war movements, solidarity movements, environmental movements, feminist movements, you name them, right in our own immediate history, they've made a big difference. When the labor movement has been the centerpiece of most struggles for social justice for obvious reasons, when people get together, even people who are poor and without power and privilege and so on, when they get together, they can do quite a lot. In fact, there's no limits to what they can do. But if they sit alone and ask, what can I do, nothing will happen. And it's not that there's any big secrets about this. We all know how to do it. If you're interested in If you're concerned with something, you ask, first of all, what it is. You find other people who have similar concerns. They usually exist right near you, and maybe they're even organized. You join them, and you do the kinds of things that will advance those interests and concerns in coordination with others. It can get to be huge mass movements. I mean, for example, let's take, say, that we're the richest country in the world. Let's take the poorest country in the hemisphere, where people, and ask how they reacted. Haiti. You know, there is no country that has fewer opportunities than Haiti. I mean, it is just total. It was a very rich country, I should say. And a lot of Europe's wealth comes from Haiti, which was the richest colony in the world, and the U.S. took plenty of it too. But now it's a desert, practically. Well, you know, a couple of years ago, people in the poorest people in the hemisphere, in the Haitian slums and the hills, managed to construct, out of their own efforts, a vibrant, lively civil society based on grassroots movements and unions and all sorts of things. And it was so powerful. Nobody was paying any attention to it because nobody looks at what goes on with those weird people. But it got powerful enough so it swept its own president to office, astonishing everybody and calling forth huge terror, of course, which we incidentally backed. But that's what you do about it. Now, you know, if we were to do that, there would be no terror, because nobody can do that to us. And, you know, the capacity, if we want to understand something about democracy, we should go to places like Haiti and ask people there what democracy is. The idea that we're going to Haiti to teach them democracy isn't even ludicrous. I mean, we should go there to learn lessons in what democracy is so that we would understand the kinds of things that you're asking about, which people here have forgotten. You know, they don't understand what they know what illiterate peasants know up in the hills in Haiti. So let's go there and ask them. You know, actually, we can figure it out without asking them. But those are the answers. And people do it under conditions incomparably worse than any we can dream of. So we can certainly do it. Balcony. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's pretty hard for me to see the balcony, but if somebody will make themselves... Okay, I see some hands, but what? Somebody... Yeah.
One thing I want to say is you can vote with your wallet. Every time you spend money, figure out who's getting that money. And second, last year on TV, I heard both you and Ralph Nader say that the major threat to civilization is the proliferation of multinational corporations. Well, we see right in Oregon right now, the Silicon Valley of California is coming up here to pollute our areas because of our cheap water, cheap labor, and cheap energy. And there's going to be 120 new semiconductor plants built in this country. And we need to do an international organizing effort about that. And we in Eugene are starting that with the Citizens for Public Accountability. So I just want to give you feedback about that.
Well, you're certainly right about spending the money. And in fact, there's good data on this, which just came out from one of the Center for Responsive Politics, I think it's called, just came out with data on a study of the effect of the correlation between campaign spending and electoral victory in the 1994 elections. They do this regularly. And it turns out that about 90% of the people elected in 1994 were people who spent much more than their opponent. That's higher than 1992, and this is a pattern that goes way back in history, which translates into saying that those who are capable of buying the election win the election to an overwhelming degree. 90% is not a small number. Of course, they are the transnational corporations and the other business groups and those who amass enormous amounts of capital and can only be combated in an electoral arena by a very highly organized public. That's one of the reasons why business and the government that they more or less run are so intent on destroying labor unions, because they are the core of the opposition to this, the best major way in which people have been able to combat it. So you're right about spending money, but it doesn't help if one of us spends money. You're not going to compete with the private tyrannies whose profits are going through the roof and control. The Fortune 500, for example, control about 2/3 of the entire gross domestic product of the United States right now, plus a big piece of the international economy. And those are private tyrannies. Remember that. Those are totalitarian institutions. If anything deserves the name, they're not accountable to the public. They're completely hierarchic internally. They do what they want. you don't have any control over them. The more, very limited controls. Actually, technically, there is a control. They all have state charters, and it could be taken away. But until we remember what democracy is, that question won't arise. As it stands, they have tyrannical control and extraordinary power. And while you can try to compete with them in the electoral arena, and it's worth doing, you have to remember that that requires massive organization of, say, the Haitian type. On the transnational corporations, I think you're right, and I don't know exactly what your group is doing, but you got to think through what this means. The problem isn't a chip manufacturing plant. That may be good or bad. You can worry about it. But the problem is who's making the decision to put it there, and who's going to run it, and who's going to decide what it does, and so on. In a democratic system, people here and elsewhere would be making those decisions. In a system where power is vested in private, tyrannical, unaccountable systems, it's done other ways. Institutions, it's done other ways. And those are the crucial issues. We could vary maybe on our opinions as to whether it's a good or bad idea to have a chip plant, but I don't think at least people who believe in democracy ought to differ on the question of who should make that decision. Somebody else up there?
I'm surprised by your previous comment when you said that if we organize and take action, that nothing like what happened in Haiti would happen to us, when we know in history that garment workers were massacred. The Valentine's Day massacre, and students were shot at Kent State. I think that we have to have courage and understand that the people who would do this to Haitians would also do as much. It falls in with what you said about who wins and who loses.
Yeah.
And I think that we should organize these more seriously in terms of what we're up against.
Could you hear the question? Comment? Yeah, let me repeat. She pointed out that I had said that what happened in Haiti wouldn't happen to us, but garment workers were killed in the United States and students were killed at, did you mean Kent State? Yeah, at Kent State, and in fact, authorities can do things to us too. Yeah, things can happen, but have a look at the scale. Kent State, 4 people were killed. Actually, it's kind of interesting that we only remember Kent State. About a week or so before that, I think it was 8 students were killed at Jackson State, which is a black college, but somehow that's disappeared. So, okay, I don't mean to say that you forgot. I mean we forget. But yes, a few students were killed, and that's an atrocity, but 12, The garment workers, yes, they were killed. In fact, throughout the early part of the century, the United States had an unusually violent labor history. In fact, it appalled even the right wing in Europe. Into the late 1930s, workers were getting killed. I think, if I recall, about 700 through the early part of this century, from about 1900 up till the late 30s. Well, 700 is an unpleasant number, but and 12 is an unpleasant number, but in Haiti, in 2 years, little tiny country, in 2 years it was like 4,000. And in Central America in the 1980s, it was maybe 200,000. And in Indonesia in 1965, when it became our huge friend, it was maybe 500,000 or 1 million, something in that order, mostly landless peasants within 4 months, which led to total euphoria in the United States, I should say. So, yeah, you're right about the violence, but look at the scale. And the scale tells you something. Whatever kinds of repression people face here is invisible by comparative standards, at least for those of us who are relatively privileged and the right color skin and that sort of thing. For people with a relative degree of privilege and right color and so on, there's, by comparative standards, the repression is extremely limited. It's true it's there, but, very limited. And the chances that terror of the, say, Haitian type could be used against a popular movement in the United States are pretty remote. There's certainly nothing in history to suggest that it could happen. Yeah.
What do you think of the intents and purposes might be of the Ross Perot phenomenon?
Well, what are the intents and purposes of the Ross Perot phenomenon? On the intents, I really don't know. I don't understand what they're up to or purposes, but I think you can understand the appeal. It's easy to understand the appeal. The fact is that, to an astonishing extent, civil society has dissolved in the United States. It's pretty astonishing. So, for example, over 80% of the population, the latest figures were 82% of the population, don't think that there's a democratic system at all. That is, on the regular Gallup polls, there's a question, who does the government work for, and there are various choices, and one of them is the few and the special interests, not the people, meaning it's not a democratic system. That's been running about 50% for a while. It just shot up to over 80%. On the economic system, over 80% think it's inherently unfair in recent polls. Cynicism about institutions is going through the roof. It's also accompanied by huge confusion. So, for example, a considerable majority of the population thinks that the government has a responsibility to help poor people, but a considerable majority of the population is opposed to welfare, that is, the government helping poor people. Well, that's a success of the doctrinal system, which has gotten into people's heads the idea that welfare means giving money to black women, maybe black teenagers or black women driving Cadillacs and, breeding like rabbits because we're going to pay for them. Okay, if that's what welfare is, then no sane person wants to pay their hard-earned money for that. But if money is going to go to poor people, which indeed welfare does, then they're perfectly happy to pay for that. Incidentally, people vastly overestimate the part of the federal budget that goes to welfare. It's very slight. It's always been slight. It's declined about almost close to half since 1970. So you get plenty of confusion. Like over 80% of the population thinks that working people don't have enough say in things. But a majority think that unions have too much of a say in things. Well, that's the only way in which working people can have a say of things, but unions have been demonized. Okay, so what you have is a very cynical population, very confused, scared, frightened, angry, full of hate, easy to, a very dangerous situation, a kind of situation in which demagogues can easily construct scapegoats that people want to kill, immigrants, welfare mothers, who knows what. And in that kind of, civil societies collapsed in another respect. There's very little in the way of organization in the United States. So political parties don't exist. Like most of the population, I think over half the population thinks that both of the parties should simply be disbanded. They don't have anything to do with anything. And they're not participant parties anyway. You can't get together and decide on the party platform. It's handed down from above. Unions, which were traditionally in most countries here too, a leading force for social justice and democracy, they have declined. They still exist, but they severely declined. And the same is true of other kinds of organizations. People literally don't even join bowling leagues anymore. On the other hand, there's a very significant proliferation of grassroots organizations on every imaginable issue, but very localized. Often people don't know what's going on in the other, couple blocks away. So there's plenty of people involved. I don't know how many, but huge numbers of people are involved in something or other, but in a highly local way, usually very specific issues, very specific issue-oriented, and unrelated to other things that ought to be connected with them, a little bit somewhere else. Now, in those conditions, very strange things can happen. One of the things that can happen is the Ross Perot phenomenon. People are just looking for something, anything, maybe that, I mean, if, somebody came and said, I'm from Mars and I'm going to lead you, they'd probably vote for that too. I'm not joking, incidentally. These are the conditions under which millenarian movements with messiahs have in fact developed in many societies. We don't have to look back very far to see similar situations. We're different than other countries, but there are analogs, if not parallels. So, in a way, I think it's analogous to Iran around the late 70s, when there were big popular movements developed to try to get rid of this tyranny. Well, they ended up, under control of extreme religious fundamentalists. Actually, something like this happened in Germany in the late 30s. It's not a joke. People were frightened of, society was dissolving, everything was going wrong, they didn't know who to blame, and somebody came along and said, blame it on the Jews. Okay, blame it on the Jews. It worked. And who? Well, it'll work if we let it work. There's certainly a lot of people who would like it to work. What's all the hysteria about immigrants about? Or about welfare mothers? Or, what's that for? Well, that's part of these efforts. It's like blaming it on the Jews.
Well, isn't it like all of it is smoke screen for everyone anyway? You said if we believed in democracy. Okay, I'm 45 years old. You tell me in those 45 years, where has democracy been? Because I believe it hasn't been.
You believe?
Yeah, what you stated is that the United States claims to be democratic, but in fact, in the United Nations situation, it doesn't act that way. It's completely snowballing everybody. It's completely controlling everyone. And at home, people are free to speak if they want until they get too risk-oriented for those people higher up.
Well, who have the people higher up stopped from speaking?
Pardon me?
Who have the people from higher up stopped from speaking?
Martin Luther King.
Well, first of all, we don't know that people from higher up did it, but let's say they did. There are plenty of people who are speaking. There are plenty of SNCC activists, plenty of other civil rights activists. They keep speaking. To the extent that there has been repression here, like Black Panther leaders were killed, and it's not zero. But the idea that we face the kind of repression that keeps us from speaking up, I don't think is to be taken seriously when you think about what is faced by other people who do speak up.
It's the idea to keep us divided.
Yes, that's true.
The government is playing a great game and having two parties that fight and argue all the time. There's no unification among the people because nobody knows what to believe.
Yeah.
And it's all to keep them all disempowered so that the game goes on.
Yeah, so your point is that the government is trying to keep us disempowered so that the game goes on and two parties, and it's not really democratic. I think there's something right about what you're saying, but if you don't mind my saying so, I think you're being caught up in the propaganda system. It's not the government who's doing this. The government is a reflection of private power. And part of there's been a huge propaganda campaign in the last 50 years on the part of a very class-conscious business community who are kind enough to tell us what they're doing, namely fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinating people with a capitalist story and so on and so forth. That's what the huge public relations industry is about. And they have very definitely have the goals that you're mentioning, and indeed one of their goals is to make you hate the government. Now, there's plenty wrong with the government, and they'd love you to blame everything on the government. But the reason that they want you to hate the government, the reason that they've been building up this sense of anti-politics, let's get rid of schools and public assistance for health and everything else, is because they would like you to blame it on the government and not look and see where power is, namely in the Fortune 500. So the... government has a flaw that General Electric doesn't have. Government is potentially democratic. There's a way of influencing the government and participating in it. I'm not joking. Think about it. And when you say the government is doing this, that, and the other thing to us, sure, the government is reflecting the interests of the people in it, but they could be representing us. There is no way for private tyrannies to be representing us. So yes, they would like you to hate the government. A lot wrong with the government, a lot to be hated about it, a lot to be changed about it. But the main thing about it is you can participate in it. There are ways of changing what it does, and therefore it's got, for at least people who believe in democracy, advantages that other systems of power don't have. It's potentially our system of power, and private corporations aren't. So yeah, I think I'd kind of halfway go along with what you're saying. And if the system is not, to the extent that the system is not democratic, it's not 0 or 100%, somewhere in there, and it changes, to that extent it's because we've succumbed to a propaganda offensive and institutional arrangements which have in fact kept people separated and isolated and atoms of consumption and not dealing with each other and hating each other and so on, and that's within our control. especially for relatively wealthy and privileged people, it's very much within your control. And it's true that there's some repressive apparatus down there, but when you look at what happens around the world, I mean, for us to be talking about repression is a joke. I mean, if student groups in Indonesia can pass resolutions saying Indonesia ought to get out of East Timor, if working people in Indonesia can stand up and say we want to have unions, if writers in Indonesia can get up and say we want a free press under the conditions of Indonesia, and they do, for us to worry about repression is not even a joke. And you don't have to go as far as Indonesia. You can go right south of the border. I mean, just cross the border into our traditional domains, and you will see what it means for people to speak up. If Jesuits in Central America, in El Salvador, speak up, they get their brains blown out by the U.S. trained security forces. That's not happening to us. Okay. So,
if you could share with me your thoughts on, in organizing large groups, their tendency to project all the vital energy of a group which would challenge tyranny into a single or a couple individuals who, if they happen to be taken out, the movement dies. Your thoughts on that?
So the question, if I understood it correctly, is what happens to movements that are so keyed to particular leaders that if they are taken out, the movement dies? To project. Well, that to the extent that exists, we just don't understand what democracy is. I mean, a democratic system is one in which the population is doing things. Now, if a group gets organized, there's always somebody to come around and say, yeah, I'm happy to be your leader, follow my orders. And to the extent that you allow that to happen, well, you've given up, not just because their orders will be for them, not for you, which is usually the case, but that's the wrong structure. So it's perfectly true that if a popular organization is so hierarchically structured and controlled in such an authoritarian fashion that taking out a leader can kill it, well, there was something wrong with that popular organization from the very beginning. I mean, that's Leninist organization on the left, and of course it's tyrannical. What else could you expect it to be? It'll lead to the Soviet Union.
So who is it that Adam Smith is talking about?
Pardon?
You're talking about the we, the they that Adam Smith is talking about.
Who were the we and the they that Adam Smith was talking about?
Is it both the individuals at the very top, or is it the institutions themselves?
Well, it's not really the individuals. It is the institutional structures that exist, just as in his day. Like when he was talking about the merchants and the manufacturers who have taken state power to advance their interests, he wasn't necessarily talking about this particular person over here. Maybe that particular person over there is a merchant and he's very benevolent and wants to give away everything and so on. Maybe. But he was talking about a structure of merchants and manufacturers, and we have a structure of institutions too. We have our economic system, our social and economic system is based on arrangements of private power. They are fairly recent in corporations, basically. They're pretty recent. They don't go back that far. They got their powers mostly in the early part of this century. It's not like ancient history. They achieved through courts mainly, not through legislation, the rights of private persons, in fact, immortal persons with all the rights of persons except you're immortal and you're huge, and even things like freedom of speech don't make any sense for an institution that's for people. And they have now grown and expanded enormously to the extent that the top 500 of them, which have just celebrated their fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth, now control 2/3 of the domestic economy and, as I said, a large part of the international economy, and they're pretty much out of control, unaccountable. That you don't know what they're doing, and they don't have to ask you what they're doing. You can follow their orders if you want, but that's about it. Those are hugely powerful institutions, basically totalitarian in character, and yes, they have an enormous effect on what the government does. That's why 90% of those who spent more than their opponent won the last election. It's the main reason. And it's also why the policies of both political parties are way to the right of the attitudes of the general population. So the general population on issue after issue is over here, and both political parties are over there. And if you look where they are, it's where the bosses are. Take, say, balancing the budget. That's considered the major issue. We've got to balance the budget. Business is totally in favor of it. Both political parties are in favor of it. When Clinton gets up and makes a speech, he said, of course, we have to balance the budget. That's not in question. How about the population? Well, about 5% of the population thinks it's the most important issue. 5%. That's the same percent that thinks that homelessness is the most important issue. That's where the public ranks it. When people are asked, should we even do it, about a quarter say yes. When they're asked the sensible way, should we balance the budget if the cost is education or health or environment and so on? In fact, should we balance the budget under any realistic conditions? Well, depending on how the question is asked, it's usually about a quarter of the population think so at all, and 5% think it's an important issue. So, but nevertheless, the parties are over somewhere else. Well, they happen to be where the business community is. Same on every other thing. The Pentagon, but the public does want some parts of the budget cut, namely primarily the Pentagon. By about 6 to 1. By about 6 to 1, the population is opposed to raising the Pentagon budget. That's the one part that's going up. Okay, and in fact, it's dramatic. It's rather dramatic to see how overwhelmingly opposed the public is to almost everything that's being rammed through. Well, okay, that gives you the beginnings of an indication of where the roots of political power are. If you look more closely, you'll find that this goes way back. In fact, if you look very closely, you'll find that the country was founded on that principle. Go back to the Constitutional Convention and have a look at what James Madison was explaining to the convention, which in fact got implemented in the Constitution. His point that he insistently made was that democracy is very dangerous. If they had it in England, their model for a possible society at the time, if there was democracy in England, people would get together and vote and take away the rights of landed proprietors. And therefore we can't permit that, so we better not have democracy. He said the government has to be constituted so that it fulfills the prime responsibility of government, which is, in his words, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. It has to be set up that way, and in fact it was set up that way. And that debate, this goes on right up to the present. That's the core of the Eisenhower-Dulles discussions that I was referring to. And there's a whole democratic theory, so-called, which is about this, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't have to be the case. And in fact, over time there have been many struggles, many victories for democracy and freedom and rights in this country. I mean, in the 1920s, it looked very similar to now. Total business dominance, no workers' rights. The Red Scare of the Wilson administration had virtually destroyed the unions, had eliminated independent thought. It was considered the end of history, in fact. Great joy about the end of history, tyranny of the masters and so on. Okay, a couple of years later it all fell apart, and there was a militant and vigorous popular reaction which led to substantial range of rights for working people and poor people and organization and so on, and it succeeded, got the government to devote some of its resources, not a trivial part, in fact, to the needs of the general population instead of the minority of the opulent. And it just goes on and on like that. There's a constant struggle. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. There will continue to be an unequal struggle as long as there is a concentration, as long as there are tyrannical systems that control internal to them the mass of the decision-making over how the country works. In other words, as long as there's a private corporate system of manufacturing and financial and service and other industries. But those are illegitimate structures. There's no reason why they should exist. In a democratic society, I don't think they'd exist.
Is not only a failure, but is a cause of great damage to society, domestically as well as internationally. Yet the conventional wisdom is that it's political suicide for a politician to even suggest anything approaching this.
Mm-hmm.
the United Nations festivities, the president made that the thrust of his speech.
That's right.
Comment on that.
Yeah, that's an important point. He pointed out, tell me if I get it straight, that a lot of people are saying that the war on drugs is a disaster and a social disaster and all sorts of problems, but the common wisdom is that for a politician to get up and say we ought to do something sensible about this is suicidal. And the president, in his speech at the UN the other day, made this the centerpiece in the war on drugs. That's quite correct, but the reason why it's it's had very clear effects on society. It has had no effect on the use of drugs, but it has had plenty of social effects. Like it's filled the prisons. The prison rate in the United States has zoomed since 1980. We were at the level of the worst countries in the industrial world around 1980. We're now way beyond them. The prison population has gone up by 3 or 4 per capita since 1980 without any change in the crime rate, and it's going up even further. And it's mostly possession of drugs. In fact, highly targeted possession of drugs. The laws are crafted so that the urban ghettos get way more penalties than, say, the white suburbs. But yes, it's had those effects. It has had almost no effect on the use of drugs, and I don't think it was intended to. The same is true in the third world. It's had a big effect on intensifying counterinsurgency operations against peasants and, massacres by paramilitary forces run by landowners in the military. Hasn't changed drug production. So whatever it is, it's not having an effect on drugs, and I don't think it's intended to. In fact, if you look at the president's message the other day, here's what a free press ought to say about it, in my opinion. At the UN on Sunday, President Clinton announced that we were now in a national emergency, an unusual threat to the national security and all that kind of stuff. And he had said he had ordered, the U.S. government to, and he now called upon others to join us with this, people and other countries, to identify nations, persons, and companies, businesses, that were involved in money laundering or that were significantly involved in the drug traffic in Colombia. The wording was approximately like that. Well, if we all want to do our patriotic duty, we can easily help him out on that. Easily. In fact, just using just plain government sources. So, for example, who's involved in money laundering? Well, there was, a year or two ago, a study by the OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, did an analysis of the flow of money from narco trafficking. It's illegal, so you can't be certain of the numbers. But their estimates are that more than half of it goes through U.S. banks. Okay, so we know right off what financial institutions to go after if we're interested in money laundering. Actually, 7% goes to Colombia, according to them. You can hardly claim that was a secret. It was reported in the country's leading newspaper, but unfortunately not this country's leading newspaper. It was reported in Mexico's leading newspaper, Excelsior. I don't think it was ever reported here, although it's an OECD study. So if we want to go after institutions involved in money laundering, we know just where to start and put them out of business, because that's what the president said we have to do. Well, what about persons? What about companies involved in a significant way in the production of drugs in Colombia? Well, there's some evidence about that too. During the Reagan years, the CIA and I think the Congressional Research Service, one of the main research services, government research services, did some studies of flow of chemicals from the United States to Latin America. From big American corporations to Latin America. Well, it turned out they discovered that that the chemical exports to Latin America are way in excess of industrial needs. And if you look at the chemicals that are being sent, it's the ones that are being used to make cocaine. So we know just which companies to go after if we're interested in the significant involvement in the drug flow in Colombia. Well, what about nations? That was the other. What nations are involved in the drug racket in Colombia? Well, there's one obvious one, namely the nation it's giving half of its military aid for Latin America to Colombia, to the military, which is all in bed with the narco-traffickers. I mean, if you want to, it's not a big secret either. You can read it in every Amnesty International report and Human Rights Watch report and church group study and every international monitor and the European Parliament and everyone else. All the studies point out what is obvious to anyone, that there's a linkage, close linkage between the military, the narco-traffickers, the landowners, the paramilitary forces, and the military that we're funding isn't even officially involved in drugs. That's the police. We're not, we're funding them to some extent, but it's almost all going to the military, which is indeed involved with narco-trafficking. And that's half of our military aid to the hemisphere going up under Clinton. So there's sort of an obvious start on nations that are involved in, in drug production in Colombia. And we can go on like this. Again, if there was a free press, that's what it would be saying. And if it doesn't say it, you ought to be saying it, or at least look into it and find out about it. And then there's an answer to those questions and also an answer to your question. If this is correct, and I think it is, it means that this has nothing to do with the war on drugs. And in fact, then we can ask the question, well, why is there a war on drugs altogether? I mean, drugs aren't good for you. But in terms of the actual harm that they carry out, most of the harm that they carry out is due to the fact that they're illegal. If you look at, say, deaths from drugs and compare them with, say, deaths from tobacco, it's nowhere near. In the case of soft drugs like marijuana, although it's surely not good for you, I don't think there is a single recorded overdose. And I saw over 60 million users. And furthermore, the use of drugs harms you, but doesn't harm other people. The use of tobacco harms other people, and it's vastly greater in scale. Well, Philip Morris is the biggest corporate advertiser for the Gingrich Congress. And the deregulation is just freeing them up from, in the tort reform, from any protection by victims. Okay? And if you look at what they're doing in the third world, the U.S. is using muscle, real muscle, to force open foreign markets to advertising aimed at women and children in Thailand and China and so on. And if countries won't agree to let us advertise our lethal narcotics there, we're going to impose trade sanctions on them, which is serious in the case of a big country like the United States. That's state power. It directly involved in serious narco-trafficking, not at a small scale. In China, there was one recent study by an Oxford University epidemiologist who estimated that about 50 million people will die from the use of tobacco in China, who are, I think he said the one now under 20 or something like that. Big numbers. Okay, so there's a lot you can do about trafficking in illegal narcotics. Not illegal, unfortunately, but maybe they shouldn't even be illegal, but I'm not suggesting that they should, but trafficking in lethal narcotics. And in fact, there's a lot of questions that can be asked. But getting back to your point about why is it suicidal for any politician to say any of these things, the reason is we've let the propaganda win. So yes, it's possible for people to say obvious things. Yeah, I mean, all anyone hears is that, so you're sure they believe it. I mean, if the only thing you hear is one thing, well, why shouldn't you believe it? Nobody's saying anything else. But we have plenty of opportunities to get a different message out. Again, there's a lot of opportunities for people like us in a society like this. If you don't make use of them, then yes, it'll still be impossible for people to think rationally about the topic. To think rationally about the fact that the major effect of the war on drugs is something comparable to social cleansing in Colombia. In Colombia, the paramilitary forces go out and get rid of people that they don't like. Peasants, union leaders, street kids, whoever you don't like, you get rid of them, you slaughter them. That's called social cleansing. Well, here we're a more civilized society. We put them in jail, instead of social cleansing. And the technique for putting them in jail to an overwhelming extent is victimless actions, which are called crimes, like having a joint in your pocket. So there's a reason for it, and there's an effect of it. And people should be able to understand that. But not if they don't hear it, So how do you change universities so they're more open to critical thought and independent ideas and so on and so forth. It's about the easiest. I mean, there are a lot of hard tasks in the world, but this is about the easiest one there is. I mean, there are very few, universities are not utopia, but of all the institutions you can think of, it's hard to imagine one that's as free, At least I never heard of one. I mean, there are pressures, undoubtedly, but there's just an enormous range of things that people can do inside a university to change what's taught and how it's taught and how people look at things and so on. In fact, let me take my own university, MIT. It just changed radically in the late 60s through the action of a relatively small number of students who managed to organize most of the student body to free the place up and make them think about all kind of things that they'd never talked about, like the dependence of the university on military spending and, the social effect of technology and all sorts of questions that nobody had ever thought about. This is the main, this is the main Pentagon university in the world, in the country, meaning in the world, and it just changed. It changed very significantly, actually, through the involvement of a small number of students. One of them, I just gave a talk that he organized up in Olympia before I came here. He now teaches at Evergreen State University. He was undergraduate then. And there weren't more than a handful of them. And a lot of them have gone out and done quite good things, like South End Press grew out of it, Z Magazine grew out of it, a lot of the local organizing around grows out of it, and so on. Well, it's a couple of kids from MIT who within managed to get most of the student body, actually the majority of the student body, directly involved in these things. Okay, I wouldn't say it's not a revolution, but it's a big change. And there can be more changes like that. And there is no place easier to carry changes like that out than inside a college and a university. Now, of course, there are going to be limits. Like if colleges and universities got too free and independent, you would run into problems not so much inside the university as in the relation between the university and the outside society. So universities are parasitic. They depend on outside systems, like state legislatures and private corporations and so on. And in fact, in the late 60s, when universities like MIT were starting to get too free and independent, places like IBM were starting to set up their own counterpart colleges, saying, okay, you don't teach obedience the way we want, we'll do it ourselves, And hence, the state legislature is an even more obvious, force in a state university. But that's the point at which trying to free up the universities becomes engaged with the problem of democratizing the whole society. You're never going to be able to do these things in isolation. So there's plenty of ways to do it, and it's like everything else. You just have to try. And there's plenty of successes. There are plenty of successes. It's not that it's an impossible task.
You've been listening to MIT Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy, Noam Chomsky, delivering the 1995 Ava Helen and Linus Pauling Memorial Lecture for World Peace. The title of Professor Chomsky's lecture was Prospects for World Order. The lecture was delivered on the Oregon State University campus in Corvallis, Oregon, on November 24, 1995. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work, please visit his website at www.chomsky.info. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. To find out more about this program and the many other programs in our video and audio library, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find programs featuring speakers such as Amira Haas, Paul Krugman, Phyllis Bennis, Jeff Halper, Diana Butu, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Maintained by force often seems less reasonable to others than to us. So we have to teach them regular lessons in reasonableness. This was part of a call for expanding the military budget. I should say a sanitized version of that did appear in his writings, but with a very different tone. I might add, it'd be only fair to add, that the more humane among the conquerors didn't find those measures so reasonable. For example, Adam Smith, who bitterly condemned what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, who he saw very clearly 200 years ago were brutally creating the first world, third world divide that is now so dramatic and was far less so at the time. Well, Adam Smith was a figure of the Enlightenment, pre-capitalist, anti-capitalist in fundamental ways, and he was also smart enough to detect the fundamental illusions of the realist picture that Churchill so eloquently articulated. The first is that contrary to the Churchillian version, the rich men enjoying their ample habitations are never satisfied. Rather, they will follow what Adam Smith called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. The second and more crucial point is that the we who are enjoying their vast and splendid possessions were not the people of England, nor of France, nor of the United States, nor other imperial powers, except occasionally by accident. Rather, continuing in his words, the principal architects of state policy design it to ensure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of their own country. That's a very valid comment. In his day, the principal architects were the merchants and manufacturers of England, as he explained. Today, it's the huge transnational corporations and financial institutions that dominate the domestic economy and, in fact, the international economy, and hence its politics as well. Well, to correct the realist vision with Adam Smith's insights, it comes out like this. The rich men of the rich societies will pursue their vile maxim, seeking to expand their vast and splendid possessions that they have gained by violence and hold by force, resorting to savage injustice when necessary, so that and those who do not will simply fall by the wayside. The lot of the vast majority of people, including those of their own countries, is simply to serve and suffer. Well, that's the realist vision. The other vision of world order, the competing one 50 years ago, was the vision of the United Nations, or at least the rhetoric that accompanied its founding, which I won't review because you're engulfed in a flood of such pronouncements and it's unnecessary to repeat them. As to which of the conflicting visions prevailed, history has provided a rather clear and unflattering answer. Now, there were and are, of course, plenty of people deeply committed to the vision of the rhetoric that accompanied the United Nations then and now, and who sought to make it more than mere rhetoric. That includes, I suppose, the vast majority of the population of the world, which is why reality has to be masked in so much secrecy and deceit. It's why the occasional honest comment, such as Churchill's before the First World War, has to be concealed from the population for almost a century in this case. And I think it'll be a long time before they study it in British schools. Those who wanted to make the reality closer to the rhetoric included also prominent individuals, Linus and Helen Pauling ranking high among them, but real power has always resided elsewhere. Well, in the United States, attitudes toward the United Nations have oscillated over the years from great praise to utter contempt. I'll return to that at the end, suggesting a rather simple realist principle that I think accounts for the variations. But first, let's look at the failures and flaws of the United Nations that have caused these changes in attitudes towards it. There is a standard version of this. It runs sort of like this. At the beginning, there were great hopes. They were dashed by the Cold War. The when the Cold War ended, around 1989, 1990, there was a period of hopefulness, and then the hopes were dashed again by the ethnic conflicts that swept the world since. Well, here are some representative quotes from the most interesting period, 1990, right after the end of the Cold War and before the new catastrophes began. These are from the Washington Post and the New York Times and leading columnists and editorialists, but they're perfectly standard. I've actually reviewed a lot of them in print, and this is a completely exceptionless pattern. So here's a few. During the long Cold War years, the Soviet veto and the hostility of many third world nations made the United Nations an object of scorn to many Americans who were rightly appalled by the sight of brim-faced Soviet ambassadors casting vetoes and shrill anti-Western rhetoric from third world nations. Although with the end of the Cold War, 1988-89, Soviet policy changed, bringing about a wondrous sea change in the United Nations, which can finally work the way it was designed to. Well, that's the picture as of 1990, and then comes the disillusionment. The era of ethnic conflicts replaced the Cold War, and the UN again failed to deal with them, so maybe the time has come to bid it farewell. That's in capsule form the story. What I'd like to do now is to look at these two eras, the Cold War and the ethnic conflicts, and compare the vision with the reality, and also ask just what role the UN played in this. So let's take the Cold War. Well, again, there's a standard version. I don't have to waste much time on it. You've heard it over and over. It was, for example, articulated by President Kennedy, who proclaimed that the communist world, from Havana to Moscow to Peiping, as it was in those days, to Saigon and so on, is a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy planning to take over everything else. His right-hand man, Robert McNamara, announced in his confirmation hearings that Soviet aggression has no historical parallel. Its goal is It is, needless to say, an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak in the Pauling Lecture Series, and a particular privilege to be able to do so today on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, as the contours of a new world order were being constructed from the ashes of the most terrible single catastrophe of human history. There were conflicting visions at the time of what the New World Order of the day should be, and they're still highly relevant. One view was that of the United Nations, which is now possibly facing its demise. The second was a view that is sometimes called realism in international relations theory, which was critical of the utopianism that accompanied the founding of the United Nations. The realist vision was articulated with great clarity 50 years ago by one of the most respected and important statesmen of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, who was speaking for the victors, one of the big three. He explained that, I'm quoting him now, the government of the world must be entrusted to the satisfied nations who wish nothing more for themselves than what they have. Our power placed us above the rest. We are like rich men dwelling in peace within their habitations, and we must keep the hungry nations from under control, or else there will be danger. Earlier in the century, at the peak of British power before World War I, Churchill had outlined this realistic vision more fully, this time in secret, in a British cabinet meetings, records of which have recently been released after quite a few years, apparently considered rather sensitive. He said, "We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, but our claim to be left in the unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely total obliteration, without any hint of moral restraint anywhere to be found in the entire literature of Marxism and so on." That's the standard version. Now, there is a more sober version of that. For example, it's given in scholarship. So take say, the most respected American diplomatic historian, who's also a major historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis. He pretty much accepts what's called the orthodox position, post-revisionist position, it's often called. And realistically, he traces the Cold War to 1917, agreeing with George Kennan and others. As you know, right after the Bolshevik takeover in 1917, there was a Western invasion, and Gaddis explains the immediate Western invasion as defensive. On the side, I should say that this invasion was taken rather seriously. For example, Britain used poison gas, which is the ultimate atrocity in those days, like nuclear weapons after World War II. Usually poison gas in those days was reserved to those who were called recalcitrant Arabs or uncivilized tribesmen, among whom it would spread a lively terror. Again, quoting Winston Churchill and documents released about 15 years ago and yet to enter popular consciousness. Also worth reading. Well, why was the Western invasion defensive, according to Gaddis? Because it was a preemptive strike, he explains. It was taken to ward off a potential Soviet actions. In his words, it was a response to a potentially far-reaching intervention by the new Soviet government in the internal affairs, not just of the West, but of virtually every country in the world, namely the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist system. So as a preemptive strike and therefore justified. What was the challenge? Well, the challenge was obviously not military conquest, certainly not at that time, and in fact not at any time, he argues, agreeing with most serious scholarship and in fact with the internal documents. Rather, the challenge, the potential challenge that was going to come that justified the defensive invasion was the demonstration effect of an alternative social model, development model, that might have appeal in the traditional service areas of the South, but even among working people and the poor in the industrial societies themselves. That was a prospect that very greatly concerned Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, his Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and many others. And indeed, that remains the primary concern as far as the documentary record reaches, which right now is into the 1960s. Right through, that's the primary concern over the Soviet challenge. For example, when John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Macmillan of England were discussing the Soviet challenge in the early 60s, that was precisely their concern. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union. The same concerns were voiced with regard to China and Vietnam and many others. In short, it was the perceived success of the so-called communist model. It has nothing to do with communism, but that's what it's called. It's the perceived success of the communist model that was considered a threat, and that's pretty understandable when you look at the situation in the comparable Western domains. I should add that Stalin's awesome crimes were, of course, well known, but almost totally irrelevant to these calculations. Truman, for example, liked and admired Stalin, thought he was honest, said what happened inside the Soviet Union he didn't care about. He thought it would be a disaster if anything happened to the great man and his great friend, and said he could get along fine with Stalin as long as the United States got its way 85% of the time. Churchill took the same view in internal records, of course. As late as early 1945, after Yalta, that is, Churchill in internal cabinet records was defending Stalin as honest and trustworthy, and we've got to deal with him. He admired him. He spoke, in fact, very glowingly of him in private meetings. The fact that he was a mass murderer was known, but not relevant. In this respect, Stalin falls into a sort of there's a pretty traditional pattern. He falls into a long line of monsters and gangsters, including Suharto, who will be visiting in a week or so, Trujillo, Saddam Hussein, and a host of other killers and torturers, including the man who President Roosevelt called that admirable Italian gentleman who had brought fascism to Italy, and even including Hitler well into the late 1930s. The crimes are irrelevant. What's problematic is not following orders, that we don't get our way 85% of the time or more. History is very clear on that. A few years before the Kennedy-Macmillan exchanges that I just mentioned, President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had highlighted the central issue in private internal discussions, recently declassified. They were lamenting the ability of the communists, so-called, to appeal directly to the masses and gain control of mass movements, something we have no capacity to duplicate because the poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich, the big problem of world history. And as Eisenhower and Dulles and many others recognized, their own position on who should plunder whom was a pretty hard sell. And so the opposition had a kind of an unfair advantage, and they were trying to figure out how to deal with this. Well, I'm only sampling a rich record, which suggests a rather different perspective on the Cold War. That perspective happens to be reinforced quite powerfully, I think, when you look further. For example, at the quite rich and interesting record of declassified planning documents, which stress forcefully and consistently that the major threat to U.S. interests, I'm now quoting, is radical nationalism that calls for improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs based on the principle that the first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country, not foreign investors, a conception that must be destroyed in all its forms, as the State Department insisted in the Charter for the Americas that it imposed on the Western Hemisphere right in 1945 as the New World Order was being established. Those are the consistent themes that run through the whole record, as they do for Britain before us. And though I haven't looked, I imagine France and Belgium and anybody else you look at. There's also a public record, which is consistent with this. And there's some pretty dramatic examples of it. So take one example from just a few years ago. You recall that about 10 years ago, the United States was engaged in what the